Welcome back, AP. This is chapter 37. The Cold War begins. We're looking at a time period from 1945 to about 1982. Please excuse the typo here. Lots of key terms to know for this chapter. Some of them may look familiar from the KWL chart that we did in class today. The people that you should know. This chapter aligns with key concept 8.1. The U.S. responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war world by asserting and attempting to defend a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. You can, after the presentation, go over to my webpage and watch the key concept review video for 8.1. Post-war economic activities. There was a fear that after World War II, that the economy in the United States would fall into a depression. This was the fear because that's what happened after World War I. There was a slight falter immediately following the war, and there were some acts that tried to stop unionized strikes and damages that might harm the economy during this sensitive time. You also have an attempt by unions to spread membership in the South, which doesn't really work because of the racial mixing that would have had to have taken place, and this is due to the segregation that still existed in the South. There's an Employment Act, which was to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing powers. And then there was also a fear that the returning soldiers from World War II were going to flood the job market, and then there wouldn't be enough jobs available for them. So to combat this issue, the government passed the GI Bill, which provided education for returning veterans, and it also enabled the Veterans Administration to give out loans to vets for housing, farms, and small businesses. There was a time period from 1950 to 1970 in which our economy was booming. So everyone was doing well. The economy was doing well. It was healthy. The national income had doubled in the 50s and then almost doubled again in the 60s. In the United States, we held 40% of the world's wealth in that time period. You have a change in what the standard of living is, or the American dream. Now it was very common to have 2 cars in the garage, have a pool, vacation homes and recreation vehicles. More people owned their homes, and another sign of the booming wealth was to have items in your home, and one of those was the television. And so during this time period, this booming economic time period, 90% of the homes in the U.S. had a television. Women also enjoyed prosperity. There was a lot of new employment opportunities for women. However, popular culture still glorified that traditional role of women as being the homemaker and the mom, and that women were super excited and happy to be in those roles. And you can see this in the pictures below. However, this causes kind of a revolt in feminism in the 1960s, and it's a revolt against the traditional roles of homemaker and mom. So where did this prosperity or this economic boom come from? Partially from World War II, which provided a stimulus to the United States economy. There wasn't a lot of battles taking place on American soil. You have the exception of Pearl Harbor. Most of the fighting took place in the Pacific and in Europe. So the U.S. is intact and unharmed and undamaged, and now they are tasked with the responsibility of providing supplies to the European countries so that they can rebuild themselves. In addition to that, you have new industries picking up and taking off in the United States, like aerospace, plastics, sorry for the misspelling, and electronics. And then you have also scientific research and design, which is stemming or adding to the economic growth. And at the bottom, you have some of that new scientific research or the additions in technology with one of the first computers. In addition, you have cheap energy. American companies were keeping oil prices in the Middle East low. You have new technology and increase in the consumption of energy, and by 1970, a worker could produce twice in an hour labor as they could in 1950, which is again adding to the technological advancements. Farms are getting smaller in the sense that the family farm is becoming almost non-existent. It's disappearing, and you have an increase in the consolidation of farms by agribusiness. And these American farms basically feed the world's population. The Sunbelt, there's a post-war migration that boomed the population and economy of these states. If you look at the bottom here, the Sunbelt includes this region of the United States. So when I refer to it, you'll know that I'm discussing these particular states. However, the moving from area to area leads some strains on the family. It makes families more isolated. It's hard to keep friendships. But on the upside, you have states that are growing in population and economy. If you look specifically at California in 1963, their population was larger than New York. And then in the South and Southwest, you have people moving to those states for jobs, for better climate, for lower taxes. You have industries that are specific to certain states, like, for example, California and electronics. Think Silicon Valley. Texas and Florida for aerospace. And then you have military installations set up in those areas as well. So federal money is being spent in those states, which adds to the prosperity. By the 1990s, the South and the West were receiving $125 billion more in federal funds than other regions of the U.S., and this is going to cause some strains between the regions, but it's also going to knock off the North from being that political and economic region that overpowered the rest of the U.S. And the Sunbelt is going to have, since 1964, all of the presidents came from the Sunbelt. There is a rush to the suburbs. The government policy of building these types of suburbs and for providing loans to particularly white middle-class families led to what is known as white flight, where white middle-class Americans are leaving the cities for the suburbs. And the suburbs were basically cookie-cutter houses. They are all the same. They were built easily and quickly. And then the government provided first-time homebuyer loans and vet loans so that people could purchase these new homes in the suburb areas. And then with the addition of the new highways, people could live outside of the city and commute into the city for work. By 1960, 1 in 4 Americans were living in the suburbs. And again, this is because it was pretty inexpensive to buy in the suburbs because of the cookie cutter, and every house is basically the same, maybe just opposite of one another as they are side by side. They went up quickly. It's a standardization of homes. And again, it leads to white flight, and it also ends up leading to lower income or minority groups moving into specific areas of the city, which adds to segregation between the races. There is a post-World War II baby boom where more than 50 million babies were born by the end of the 1950s, and then that was followed by a drop-off of fertility. As a result of the baby boom, a lot of things in culture had to change to keep up with the babies. So when the babies reached a certain age, like 5, they had to go to school, and there weren't enough schools for all of these baby boomers to attend, so that their generation caused an increase in the construction of schools, the hiring of teachers, the selling of baby food and baby products and toys, and then that just continued through their lifespan. When they became teenagers, the culture had to change to adapt for that group of people. And again, when they're in their late 20s or college age, when they themselves are having babies, And one of the biggest things is when the generation of the baby boomers retires, it's going to put a really significant strain on Social Security. Looking overseas, we have the conference at Yalta, where the Allied powers were organizing how they were going to basically set up post-war world. Some of the things that they agreed on: Stalin and the Soviet Union agreed to a representative government in Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then the Organization of the United Nations was going to basically be the peacekeepers. And you can see occupied German and Austria areas and which countries were occupying which areas. So the British zone would have been this fuchsia color, and if you go down to America, we are the yellow color. FDR, in addition, in the conference, wanted Stalin and the Soviet Union to help in the war in the Pacific. So in order to beat the Japanese Empire, he felt that they needed the Soviet Union Red Army to help lessen the casualties. But Stalin and the Soviet Union had already suffered many casualties, much more than the Americans, as a result of World War II. So they're really skeptical. They had some agreements on how Stalin and the Soviet Union and what they would get when they helped the Allies in the war in the Pacific. So the meeting was basically like an outline of their intentions. But the problem is that the U.S. and the Soviet Union are so fundamentally different. Different economic systems, different political systems. You have democracy versus communism, capitalism versus communism. So everything is very different, and the U.S. didn't even recognize the Soviet Union for a long time after the Bolshevik Revolution because of their communist roots. Also, the U.S. had kept secret the atomic bomb building, which Stalin and the Soviets did not like, and then it leads eventually to them building their own and an arms race. Stalin, above all, wanted security of the Soviet Union. He wanted to create friendly governments along his border, and then he wanted to have a sphere of influence in Eastern and Central Europe. The U.S. took that as basically Stalin saying he wanted to create a Soviet empire, or he wants to spread communism. Now, the things that the U.S. and the Soviet Union have in common is that they were both basically isolated before World War II. They both have this history of missionary diplomacy where they try to influence other countries with revolutionary origins. Shaping the post-war world, there's an International Monetary Fund which encourages world trade by regulating currency and exchange rates, a World Bank, and the U.S. basically took the lead in creating these international bodies. They supplied a lot of the funding, and the Soviet Union chose to not participate in those. The United Nations Conference opened in April 25th of 1945. They gave veto power to basically the Big Five, which was the United States, Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China. And the United States Senate overwhelmingly approved U.S. participation in the United Nations. And this is much different from what happened with the Senate and the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, where they did not ratify it, and therefore the U.S. did not join the League of Nations. The League of Nations had success in preserving peace in Iran, Kashmir, and other troubled areas. They played a large part in creating the Jewish state of Israel. They guided former colonies toward independence, and they developed organizations to bring benefits to people around the world. They tried to limit or even stop the building of atomic weapons. The Soviets countered that they wanted possession of nuclear weapons to be outlawed. And since that wasn't the agreement and the U.S. had already developed atomic weapons, there's a suspicion on both sides of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, so each country doesn't trust the other. And this is the lost opportunity to tame the atomic beast, because what eventually happens is the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. The problem of Germany after World War II, there was an agreement that the Nazis needed to be out of government. And then they wanted to punish the Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity. So they placed Nazi leaders on trial in Nuremberg. 12 were found guilty and hung, 7 found guilty and sentenced to long jail terms or life terms. Critics of the Nuremberg trials called it a judicial lynching because the individuals were being tried of offenses that were not clear-cut crimes when the war began. There was a little else agreement. Some wanted to dismantle German factories. The Soviets wanted the Germans to pay war reparations. Americans eventually looked to revitalize Germany, and the Soviets don't want to do that. Germany was then divided into 4 zones. The Allies refused to allow the Soviets to take reparation from their zone. And the 4 zones, one belongs to U.S., 1 Great Britain, 1 France, and 1 the Soviet Union. France, Great Britain, and the U.S. began to promote the idea of a reunited Germany. This is when the Soviets tightened their control on Eastern Germany. So West and East Germany would remain divided. The Iron Curtain, which Winston Churchill refers to as those countries that are communist and those that are fundamentally democratic, are divided by this Iron Curtain. Berlin is divided but lies within the Soviet zone. And in 1948, over currency reform and control, the Soviets cut rail lines and highways from entering Berlin, with the hopes that without the supplies, the Allies would be starved out. This is a symbolic test of wills between the U.S. and the Soviets. Americans organized a giant airlift for nearly a year. It's known as the Berlin Airlift, which eventually leads to the Soviets lifting their blockade in 1949. And this then leads to the governments of East and West Germany being established. And it's basically hardening the Cold War, where it's communism versus democracy. Stalin tests Iran. He has the hope of securing more oil. The U.S. is fearful of this. Truman protests and Stalin ends up backing off. And this is where the containment doctrine comes in. It was created by George Kennan. He basically said that Russia was expansionary, but they were cautious as well, and that they needed to be contained or held in check. And Truman embraces this advice. So they want to keep communism in one specific area and not let it spread to other parts of the world. The U.S. steps up to help Greece stop communist pressure in the country. The U.S. was fearful that if Turkey fell to communism, then the rest of the Mediterranean would slowly fall to communism. So the Truman Doctrine, which was issued May 12, 1947, provided $400 million to bolster both Greece and Turkey, with the hopes that if they rebuilt their country with this money, they would have free elections, be more democratic, have a stable economy, and they wouldn't fall to communism. Doing this, again, polarizes into a pro-Soviet, pro-U.S., and ultimately it gets labeled basically as like good versus evil. Western Europe was still suffering from hunger and economic chaos. And again, there's a fear that because of this, the countries would fall to communism. So the U.S. responds with another plan, the Marshall Plan, which gave $12.5 billion over a 4-year time period to get Europe back on their feet. They offered the deal to the Soviets as well and their allies, but with the stipulation that those countries would make some political reforms, i.e. get rid of communism. But the plan was too difficult for them to accept. Congress was slow to accept until Czechoslovakia fell to communism. So you have the containment plan here, and from that, wanting to keep communism where it already was and not having it spread, the plans to do that, or the aid to help that happen, are the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Truman decides to support the Jewish state of Israel against the protest of Muslim nations. He does it against the advice of the Department of Defense. Many fear that antagonizing the Arab oil-rich countries is going to cause problems for the U.S. On May 14th, 1948, Israel was recognized, which complicates the relations in the Middle East. America begins to rearm. The National Security Act in 1947 creates the Department of Defense. It creates the Joint Chief of Staff, which was based out of the Pentagon. It also established the National Security Council, which advises on security matters. The CIA was coordinating government's foreign fact-gathering, and there's resurrected the military draft of select young men from the age 19 to 25. Western Europe unites and asks for the United States to join. The U.S. to join NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, changes previous avoidance of European entanglement. The reason is to strengthen the containment policy. The idea behind NATO is basically an attack on one is an attack on all. There were 12 original countries that joined NATO, and it was approved by the Senate on July 1st, 1949. Reconstruction and revolution in Asia. Japan was easier to help reconstruct than Germany because only the U.S. was involved in the reconstruction of that country. The Japanese cooperated. They adopted elements of free market enterprise and a constitution, which helped with their economic recovery. China, on the other hand, they fall back into their civil war of communists versus nationalists. The U.S. government tries to aid the Nationalist Party, but China falls to communism, and the nationalist leader escapes to Taiwan. There's an announcement that the Soviets exploded an atomic bomb 3 years earlier than Americans had anticipated. Truman orders the development of the H-bomb, which is 1,000 times more destructive than the atomic bomb. A group of scientists oppose development because of the possibilities of complete annihilation, and those scientists included Oppenheimer and Einstein. However, they went along with the government went on with the construction of the H-bomb, which was tested in the Bikini Atoll in 1952. Quickly following that, in 1953, the Soviets had constructed and tested an H-bomb, and now the arms race is on. Which country can have the most or largest arsenal of weapons? And that's what the picture on the bottom represents. We make 3, the Soviets make 4. We make 5, the Soviets make 6, and it's just continuing on and on and on. A fear of communism or an anti-red campaign takes place in the United States. In 1947, Truman launches loyalty programs. There's an attorney general list of 90 disloyal organizations. A loyalty review board investigates 3 million individuals, where 3,000 resign or are dismissed. They're forced to take loyalty oaths, especially teachers, and a lot of people questioned if personal freedoms could survive the Cold War climate. Richard Nixon, pictured here, and Joseph McCarthy led the Red Charge, or the anti-Red Charge. All manners of social changes could be perceived as a communist threat. And this was kind of tied into that whole witch hunt where somebody could just say you were a communist and then all of a sudden you're being hunted because someone said you had communist ties, or your actions were perceived as being communist. And so there's this huge scare and this fear of communism during the Cold War. And because Joseph McCarthy is the leader, he becomes known as a Red Hunter, and this witch hunt becomes known as McCarthyism. Espionage, you have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They're the only people who have been executed in a peacetime for espionage, and they were tried and convicted for leaking data about the atomic bomb. There's a Democratic division in 1948. Dewey was nominated for the Republicans. Truman was nominated even though he didn't have a lot of support in the South. The Democrats split. The Southern Democrats meet in Alabama and nominate Strom Thurmond as their candidate. The former Vice President Henry Wallace enters the race against the Get Tough with Russia policies, and he takes on a pro-Soviet tone. Truman is still victorious. His victory rested on the farmers, the workers, and the African Americans. Many were still not very supportive of the Republican Party, and others admired Truman's guts. The Korean War, with the Japanese surrender, Korea was separated at the 38th parallel. Japan surrendered in the north to the Soviets and in the south to the Allies or the U.S. And so then you have this division between, again, communism influence and democratic influence, which leads to a civil war. And then, of course, you have American involvement. Americans were sent as advisors into Korea to try and restore a more democratic form of government. When that doesn't work out, Truman orders air and naval units to support South Korea. He does not consult Congress. A week later, General MacArthur has troops there to assist. MacArthur took orders from Washington, not from the UN, even though the UN was there making up a bulk of the troops. MacArthur lands troops behind enemy lines. The North Koreans scrambled to get back behind the 38th parallel. Truman's intent was to restore the borders quickly, but that falls to the wayside when the South Koreans then follow into North Korea. The UN organized MacArthur to move north as long as he didn't meet intervention of the Chinese or the Soviets. China was warned against helping out. UN forces are forced southward. MacArthur wanted the U.S. to bomb China using atomic weapons again, but the U.S. refuses to use atomic weapons that quickly, and this is basically the wrong war, the wrong place, at the wrong time. MacArthur gets upset. He doesn't support what President Truman and the government are saying at that point in time. He felt like he wasn't being supported, and so he says strong words against the president, and he is eventually removed from his position. In July 1951, there were truce discussions, and it hits a snag over prisoner exchange, and the war drags on for almost another 2 years. And that is the Korean War in a nutshell, which is also known as the Forgotten War. I know that was a long presentation. One thing I do want you guys to do this weekend after you've finished your notes is to interview a family member or a family friend who lived during the Cold War and just ask them some questions on what stood out the most to them or what their life was like during that time period or what they remember, and then be ready to share it when you come to class on Monday. Have a good weekend.